Yanis Varoufakis. Good to talk to you.
Good to be here with you.
Good to meet you in person. You know, you're one of those people everybody reads a lot about. We see you on TV. I myself have to admit that I might have got caught up in the descriptions of you. There were a lot of those over the past 7-8 years, you know. Narcissist, bad boy, rebel. And I know you talk about it in your book, which I just finished this morning. Really well written. You talk about the fact that it was almost like a conscious smear of you, that they wanted to create this idea of you being somewhat trouble. Why do you think that?
Well, from my perspective, every time I read comments about, what I wear, my motorcycle, lifestyle-related comments, I despaired because I could see that whether this was conscious or unconscious, it was detracting from any serious debate about the reasons why people knew me. And the only reason why people knew me, except for a circle of academics and friends and acquaintances, was because Greece was bankrupt. And because for 7 consecutive years it was in the poorhouse, in the workhouse, in debtor's prison. That is the only reason why you know me.
Mm-hmm.
You know me because I was elected by desperate people to put an end to their debt bondage. So all discussions about me, especially the ones that were concentrating on lifestyle, detracted from the job in hand. That was a real source of concern and desperation even for me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I never believe in conspiracy theories. I don't believe that there was a conspiracy so much against me personally. But I have absolutely no doubt, and I challenge anyone to contradict me on this, that if on the 27th of January 2015, that is on the day when I assumed the Ministry of Finance, I had made a statement that I would sign on the dotted line of the next loan agreement that the Troika wanted to impose upon our desperate people. I can assure you, I would be described by the international press as a responsible minister, as somebody who was elected on a platform which was a little bit rebellious, but then the moment he stepped into the Ministry of Finance, he became far more focused on the national interest and became a Europeanist. So you will allow me not to take seriously these comments about narcissism, about being the rebel, about my image as a motorcyclist. The real game at the time was the attempt by the world's most powerful creditors to continue to extend Greece's bankruptcy into the future while pretending that they solved it. This is what was at stake.
Why did you feel it was so important for you to tell your version of events? It was a very compelling read. It was fascinating. I mean, you go into verbatim back and forth with different people, over your meetings over the years. I found it extremely insightful, and it was a man wanting to set the record straight. Why was it so important for you to set the record straight about that period of time, that window?
Well, I had the moral duty. People elected me in the midst of the worst depression in the history of capitalism in order to end it and in order to represent them in the various fora of power. Have you noticed that European democracy has been delegitimized, that the political center has crashed and burned all over Europe? The 2 major parties in France failed to put forward in the second round of the presidential election a candidate. Angela Merkel is absolutely terribly weakened. The Italian election has produced a quagmire. Britain is leaving the European Union. Now, why is this? My very simple hypothesis is that good people out there, European citizens, have had enough, have had a gutful of politicians who are elected to do a particular job. They enter rooms that are opaque to the public. They make deals behind their voters' backs, and they do exactly the opposite, effectively, of what they were elected to do. This process of opaque, old-school politics has delegitimized politics. And when politics gets delegitimized, the economics of the world deteriorate, And in the end, you have a fragmentation of societies. So, I was a very tiny player in that larger scheme of things. I was in there for 5-6 months. I left, I resigned because I could no longer do the job that I was elected to do. And I felt I had a moral, political, and, if you want, philosophical duty to tell the people who elected me and put me there what happened in there. Now, unless we have such frank memoirs that are also fresh by the people who get elected on behalf of voters, I very much fear that democracy is finished throughout Europe.
Is that why you have, one of the points I want to pick up on before we talk about some more about the memoirs, is that why you have DiEM25? Because you feel the centre's gone, and someone you speak quite glowingly about in your book, who was very helpful, Emmanuel Macron, he's done something different in France now as well, a third way, if you like, En Marche. Is that what you want for Greece, where forget the left, forget the right, let's come up with something pragmatic and different that reflects the current reality?
No, I would never forget the left and the right. This is where I disagree with Emmanuel Macron, who says that these are old-fashioned categories that are no longer relevant. I do believe that the left and the right are representing very real social and economic conflicts. The owners of capital are increasingly concentrating power in their hands, the 0.1%, if you want, and the majority of people are increasingly losing any control over their lives.
That's Marxism.
But no, that's not. That's reality.
But it's a Marxist interpretation that applies, no?
I don't think so. I think that it is a Marxist interpretation as well. But you don't have to be a Marxist to believe that.
Right.
Marx made particular recommendations about how to solve this.
Right.
And that, if you believe in those, then you're a Marxist. But I think that what I just described, I think, is a fact now. Even the Financial Times concur. And I don't think it's a Marxist rag.
Right.
So, on the one hand, the left and the right remain pertinent. But on the other, the political representations of the left and the right are irrelevant. So if you look at the Social Democrats across Europe, they are collapsing because in the name of a center-left narrative, they've done exactly the opposite. Or to put it differently, what they have done in government has been absolutely independent of any kind of center-left Keynesian social democratic perspective. The right, even neoliberals, take neoliberals in this country, in Greece. They're not really neoliberals. Somebody like Friedrich von Hayek, the guru of neoliberalism, would reject what they do outright, because, come to think of it, this idea of bailing out a country by means of the largest loans in human history provided by taxpayers in order to save bankers. I don't believe there is any libertarian. Ron Paul, for instance, in the United States, who is the main protagonist amongst the libertarian sect, would immediately condemn that.
Right.
So you have an official left, which is not at all left, an official right that ever since Thatcher is pretending to be neoliberal, but they're not neoliberal. And in the end, you have a political system that is based on pretense politics and pretense ideologies. So what is DiEM25, the Democracy in Europe movement? It is a result of an appreciation by those of us who were participating in it, that after 2008, which was our generation's 1929, the great crash that began with Wall Street, then led to a chain reaction, Great Recession, depression in many parts of the world. After 2008, the crisis is so deep that there is scope for a coming together of Democrats, independently of whether they're Marxists, liberals, centrists, environmentalists, in order to achieve that which our grandparents' generation in 1929 failed to achieve. And what's that? To create a coalition of Democrats that stretches across different European countries, that reaches out across borders and across standard party political boundaries to create an alliance that will stop the gradual slide into a kind of abyss that we experienced in the 1930s and which we are experiencing now. So we, in DiEM25, we get together with, I'm a left-winger, I always declare that. but we are getting together with people who consider themselves centrist, others who consider themselves to be neoliberal, on the basis of a minimum common program of what needs to be done in order to stabilize Europe and to prevent the depoliticization, which in the end leads to toxic politics and acceleration of the economic crisis.
You have this exchange with Larry Summers where he tells you you can either be an insider or an outsider. And he essentially tells you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my reading of it is that if you're an insider, you stay with all the perks forever and ever, and you're in the little club, but you never speak out against the insiders. You don't break rank. However, if you choose to be an outsider, you're done, you're destroyed, you're out, you lose all your special privileges very quickly. And you say you chose to be that outsider. Now, you say you don't believe in conspiracy theories, right? But it sounds very much as if the implications are that these people sit in their rooms, in the corridors of power, make decisions undemocratically on behalf of everybody else, and there's a nefariousness attached to it. You've experienced interactions with all these people, from the bankers to the leaders and so on. Do they have the bad intentions that are implied by that?
That's a fantastic question. Allow me to rephrase your explanation of my depiction of my discussion with Larry Summers, because I want to be fairer to Larry. Larry was not that cynical. He wasn't speaking to my personal benefits from remaining within the inside. I think he was slightly, more ethical than that. What he was saying was, from a pragmatic, American perspective, typical Larry Summers, that if you want to have influence,
got to play the game with him
and to change the world, at the margin,
right.
You've got to stay within. It wasn't so much if you want to get rich and have a good career and so on, stay within. No, he was more principled than that. His next point was, when he asked me, am I an insider or an outsider? He didn't ask this because he was trying to impose upon me. He was there as my aide, as my helper. And he wanted to find out what my own mentality is so that he could be on my side more efficiently. So once we set this on paper, so to speak, let me answer the second part of your question, which is pertinent. Is there a conspiracy? Well, there are no conspirators. If you want a quick answer to your question, I would say there is something that looks like a conspiracy, but without conspirators. What do I mean by that? If you read Shakespeare, King Lear or Macbeth, even better, you see that this is a dramatic depiction of individuals, neither very good people nor very bad people, who make choices, act in a way that they think is best at the time when they do. And in the process, they get caught up in circumstances not of their own choosing. And they try to cover up for mistakes, even for crimes in the case of Macbeth, by committing a new mistake or a new crime. Once you get down that path, then this is what we call in economics, there is a path dependence. You're effectively caught in a dynamic which was caused by your own actions, but you never intended to.
So when the witches tell Macbeth, okay, you will not face death nor bane until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, and he thinks the forest is going to walk towards me and I'm protected forever. And then that moment hits where they're holding the branches or whatever and they're coming, and he realizes the penny drops. Oh no, I was wrong.
Yeah.
I've been trying to cover up this prophecy or trying to work against this prophecy, but it's hitting me. Have they ever had that moment, is my question. Or do they believe they're right? So for example, the Troika. You can't tell me that they know they're wrong.
Oh yes, they do.
Really?
Absolutely. They thought
so they've seen like Birnam Wood come towards them.
In the book that you politely mentioned,
It's a good book.
Christine Lagarde, in our first meeting, at the end of a long meeting with aides and so on, she told me what really mattered when it was just the two of us. She said exactly that. She said, Yanis, after having spent an hour denying what I was saying in front of the aides, in the formal meeting, when it was just the two of us, she confessed. She said, look, Yanis, you're absolutely right. This program, the one that she was trying to impose upon me, together with the rest of the Troika, can't work for your country. We know that. But you've got to understand, we have invested so much political capital in this that we cannot go back.
Is it
And she said
ideology,
this-
though? Is
she
it
said this-
ideology or saving face?
No. It is exactly what she said. We have invested so much political capital in this that we cannot go back. So think about it. Christine Lagarde, before she became managing director of the International Monetary Fund, she was the hapless Minister of Finance of France at the time when, following the collapse of Lehman Brothers and Wall Street in 2008, suddenly she finds out that her two main banks, the two main banks of the French Republic, BNP Paribas and Société Générale, are completely and utterly bankrupt. The same thing happened in Germany with Deutsche Bank and so on. And remember, this is a country that has given away its printing presses. It's not like the United States. It's not like Britain. It's not even like Turkey that has its own central bank. France does not have its own central bank. So, to put it simply, if Greece was allowed to default, to declare bankruptcy, which it should have been, because when you're bankrupt, you've got to declare your bankruptcy. The only way of not declaring your bankruptcy is by pretending you're not bankrupt, by borrowing even more money and becoming even more bankrupt. If Greece had declared its bankruptcy, because a lot of those loans were owed to the French banks, then the French banks would simply fall over immediately. And then the French state would have to give something like 50% of national income to two banks. And of course that cannot happen, especially if you don't have printing presses. So in a state of panic, like Macbeth in the early part of the play, they committed a crime against logic by giving Greece, bankrupt Greece, the largest loan in human history. Of course, if you give a very large loan to the bankrupt, you can't expect to get it back, but they never expected to get it back. So they knew they were committing a crime against their own taxpayers, against the taxpayers of Slovenia, of Germany, of Portugal, because you have to remember that the Greek loans came from all European Eurozone member states on the false promise that the taxpayers would get their money back. That money was given to the Greek state so that the Greek state would immediately give it to the bankrupt French and German banks. So in a sense, what they did was that they defrauded Europe's citizens on behalf of their bankers. The French Minister of Finance, Christine Lagarde at the time, did this because she thought that she was answerable to the French banks. Once you commit this crime, and you lie to your parliament, in France, in Germany, and so on, then you have to keep lying.
So you believe they doubled down for the past 8 years?
They keep
non-stop?
doing it every day.
Yeah.
And Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, and I agreed entirely on that. And he actually told me that this was a terrible thing that they did. And at the same time as he was pushing me to sign the loan agreement that would extend this fraud further, he was telling me that he thought it was very good of me not to be signing, because if he were me, he wouldn't be signing.
Right, I remember that.
So you asked the question, did they know that what they were doing was wrong? Absolutely yes. Was there a conspiracy? Had they planned this sequence of crimes against logic? No. In 2008, just like the American Treasury, the American Central Bank, the British Central Bank, the British government, all governments and central banks on the European continent, they all thought that capitalism had reached a stage of development when there would be no crisis. So they could not see the crisis coming. But when the crisis hit in 2008, you remember that, they panicked. So they started pumping money into their bankers and pushing the populace into greater misery through austerity. So austerity for the masses, socialism for the bankers.
Right.
Yeah, they knew what they were doing. They felt they were much more answerable to the bankers, because don't forget that those bankers had actually financed their election campaigns for years before. They deep down, I have no doubt, especially about Christine Lagarde and Wolfgang Schäuble, they very much regret what they did. But at the same time, like Macbeth, would never admit to it. Not in public.
So slow motion car crash. They knew they were doing things wrong. They tried to cover it up. They doubled down and doubled down and doubled down, and we find ourselves wherever we are now. But you're here talking to me on a couch now, and as much as I rate myself and I like to think I'm an important person, you could have been elsewhere right now, maybe in a suit and tie, talking to more important people who can make an impact on the European Union or the world, or to try to maybe renegotiate Greece's debt. But you're not, because you chose to be that outsider. Eventually, that resignation letter that was in your pocket for a long, long time made its way out. Do you have any regrets that you didn't decide to be an insider and work the system from within? No.
Zero. Precisely zero. And you know, zero is a very radical number. No, absolutely not. And let me tell you why. Because insiders do not have the capacity to change what the insiders do. It's like a network of power that operates as extremely powerful, but each node within is absolutely powerless, including some of the nodes that you would have thought are extremely powerful men, some women too. Yeah? So in my discussions, let's say with Wolfgang Schäuble, who was definitely the most powerful node within that European power network, I was actually quite struck and saddened when I realized how powerless he was within it and how powerless he understood that he was within it. So the view that if you're inside you can make a difference is not one that convinces me. During a period of intense crisis, maybe, you know, if this was 2001, 2002, maybe there would be a point to this. Maybe being within, before the crisis hits, you can encourage the system when it is not doubling down to make changes that would not avert the crisis, but it would absorb the shocks, the shock waves of the crisis a bit better. But during the crisis, when they are, think about it, they are intentionally and knowingly condemning whole swathes of the European population into a kind of abject poverty in order to perpetuate a process which they themselves know cannot end well. And once they are caught up in this, there's nothing you can say to them for a very simple reason, that behind closed doors they all agree. So how can you shift them? You cannot. The only thing that I thought was plausible and possible, and I still believe that it was plausible and possible, was to be the finance minister of the most indebted country, or the most bankrupt country, who says, you know what, I'm not taking any more of your money. And if that means we default, we default. And that way, you force them to change course. The reason why I became so prominent had nothing to do with me personally, or my personal characteristics, virtues, or vices for that matter. It had to do with one simple thing. The only person who, by law, can sign on the dotted line of a loan agreement in the Eurozone is the Minister of Finance. And in me, they found somebody who said, no, I'm not signing. And they freaked out, allowed me to use the vernacular. If my Prime Minister at the time had backed me up, as he was saying he was going to, then we would have changed Europe. Because this extending and pretending would not be plausible anymore, or possible, for that matter.
So let's talk about your Prime Minister at the time, still the Prime Minister here. Is it accurate for me to say you guys had a falling out?
No.
You don't talk anymore?
We don't, but
Okay.
we didn't have a falling out.
Do you have sympathy for him that maybe he's just trying to work the system from within, from the inside? That's all he's trying to do.
To the extent that human beings have an obligation to have sympathy for all other human beings, the answer is possibly yes. But as a politician, I believe that he has committed a major disservice to himself as a person. I do not believe that he is going to be able to live out his life looking at himself in the mirror and feeling good about it, because he was elected to do one thing. He had a splendid opportunity to do it, and he chose not to do it in order to become an insider, while placating himself and soothing his own conscience by means of a huge, big, fat lie that he's making a difference for the better.
So do you think he wanted that referendum vote to maybe go the other way so that he could say, I had a popular mandate to go along with the Troika?
Unfortunately, I know that he wanted us to lose that referendum. Because you remember, the referendum took place in July. It was called at the end of June. I noticed by late April that he was trying to surrender to the Troika, and the Troika wouldn't let him. He was effectively accepting all the terms and conditions that the Troika was imposing upon him behind my back. So if you asked me before if we had a falling out, we never had a falling out at a personal level, but we had a very strong disagreement. When I saw that he accepted new harsh austerity towards the end of April, I could see that he was trying to surrender, effectively, to capitulate. But of course, Angela Merkel, Schäuble, and the great and the good in the European Union wanted to humiliate him because he had dared to oppose them. So every time he conceded, they asked for something more. And they always ask for things that you only ask for if you don't want an agreement. So, you know, I remember that moment when they actually were surprised that he accepted all their terms, and they asked him for, this is pertinent to Turkey as well, they asked him to accept that sales tax on hotels on islands bordering Turkey should be 24%, when in Turkey it's 7%. So they were always going to push him towards saying, look, I can't do this. I will be lynched if I go back home and I've accepted this. So towards the end of June, while he kept believing that in the end they would give him an agreement, well, that would be terrible for Greece, but at least it would be an agreement, he realized, as I had been warning him, that they wouldn't. That they want to close down the banks, to humiliate him, and to have him effectively on his knees. And at that point, he decided to have a referendum, hoping he would lose it, hoping that the people of Greece, under the stress of bank closures, of the whole media and establishment bombarding them with sort of terrorizing narratives about what would happen if they vote against the Troika, that the people of Greece would say, okay, let's say yes to the Troika, let's capitulate altogether. And then he would say, I fought to the very last moment, but the people of Greece decided to give up. I'm a Democrat. I'm going now to try to make the best deal I can make with the creditors, given the capitulation of the Greek people. So that night, when 62%, a heroic 62%, said no to the Troika, Alexis Tsipras was absolutely distraught.
So, did he sell out, and did Syriza sell out?
He sold out against himself. That is my harshest criticism. Look, the left has a very long tradition of demonizing one another. I will never attach adjectives and epithets to comrades and friends of mine, even those that I have fallen out with or that we're not together with. And I'm never going to demonize any particular person. All I'm going to say is that Alexis Tsipras was a 40-something-year-old prime minister, had a magnificent historic opportunity to help the people of Greece disentangle themselves from an unsustainable debt, from debt bondage. He didn't do it. I think he's going to regret it. He's going to regret it simply because, he's got another 30, 40, 50 years to live. And this is going to weigh down on his conscience.
When Fitch upgraded Greece's rating in February, people like myself from the outside would go, oh, maybe things are getting better. Maybe the decisions that were made by those in charge seem to be somewhat vindicated. Maybe they're playing the long game. Is that accurate?
You're going to make me despair even more. Can I remind you that Fitch, Standard & Poor's, all those credit rating agencies were, up until the moment of the complete and utter collapse of the financial system of the West, they were rating Lehman Brothers CDOs as AAA. Have we learned no lesson?
Are they political tools?
No, they're not political tools.
So what are they then? I'm not an economist.
They're
I'm
businesses.
looking for objective metrics to see where a country is going, right?
Yeah.
So when they say you get
I'll
bumped
give you
up, I think,
objective
okay, it's going
Let me
okay.
give you some objective
Okay,
metrics.
tell me.
And let me explain to you why it is perfectly possible for the Fitch rating to make perfect sense in the financial world while Greece is collapsing.
Okay, go.
It's very interesting the way you phrased it. You said, when Fitch upgraded Greece, I felt, something is happening here. Fitch do not upgrade Greece. Fitch does not rate countries, economies, labor markets. What it rates is pieces of paper. Yeah? So what they upgraded was 10-year Greek bonds. Now, you have to remember that we do not issue such bonds. We haven't issued such a bond since 2009 to 2010. So those pieces of paper that are still out there in the marketplace are very few, because we've had 10 years since then of non-issuance. Their price had gone down immensely because the Greek state was bankrupt. Now, what is happening is this, that Fitch and the other credit rating agencies look at Greece and they think, okay, the Greek state, and they say, okay, they now have an agreement with the Troika, and in particular with 1/3 of the Troika, which is the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank is now standing behind parts of the Greek debt. Why? Because it is politically expedient for the Troika to celebrate the Greek success story. Is there a Greek success story? That's something Fitch doesn't care about, because they're really not rating Greece, as I said before. So, you asked for some real metrics. Look at total employment. Has it gone up or down? It's gone down. Total employment. Don't look at unemployment, because the unemployment rate has come down for two reasons. Firstly, because hundreds of thousands of young people have left the country. This is not a reason to celebrate the upgrading of the Greek labor market. We are losing the best human capital in this country to the rest of the world. And secondly, because you have people losing their full-time jobs, and you have some people getting very precarious, very badly paying jobs that count in exactly the same way. So one person with a full-time job loses his job, another one gets 5 hours a week, for 100 euros. The statistics show that there's been no decrease in employment. Let me just give you a very simple statistic. 1/3 of the Greek labor force today lives on 380 euros a month gross, before tax, in a country which is, some would say, even more expensive than Germany. 1/3 of the labor force. That's a real metric for you. Tens of thousands of companies have either closed down since 2015 or moved to Bulgaria or to Cyprus because of the tax regime. There's been no investment whatsoever in productive capacity. There are speculative investments, so you have here near where we are today, you have an increase in the demand for houses because the Greek government sells visas to Russians, to Chinese for 250,000 euros, which of course they don't give to the state, they just buy a flat around here, so demand has picked up in the better areas around Lycabettus Hill or the Acropolis. There is absolutely, from an economic point of view, there's no metric that would tell you that there's an improvement. In 2016, the government, the Troika, celebrated the increase in national income. 6 months later, they had to confess that national income declined by 1.2%. So it is perfectly possible for a country to be in a process of desertification, like Greece is, and for pieces of paper to be going up in price, and therefore for Fitch to be upgrading them.
I want to broaden it out a little bit now. You believe the Troika screwed Greece, right? Ultimately, right? You believe at the beginning, in order to finance, as far as I understand, the French and German banks, the Greek people were squeezed and pummeled and sacrificed.
Not just the Greek people. Europe's people.
Europe's people, but Greece was the weakest.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
It was ground zero.
Ground zero.
Of the disaster. But think about it. For every euro that was paid to Deutsche Bank, or Societe Generale, the Greeks borrowed 27 cents from Germany, but they also borrowed 17 cents from Italy, and a few cents from Slovakia, from Portugal, for very, very poor countries. So very poor countries were forced effectively to subsidize Deutsche Bank and Societe Generale. Is there any wonder why the European Union is being delegitimized in the eyes of Europeans at large?
Okay, so with all of that in mind, why was it that when I was in the UK covering Brexit, there you were saying, please remain, we need to preserve this European project? Why do you care? Why do you care? Why not get rid of this thing? It's run by corrupt and useless bureaucrats sitting in Brussels.
I give you two reasons. Let me start with the first one. I believe any humanist should make such judgments on the basis of the expected income of any change, of any decision, the expected prospects, if you want, for the average citizen. So the question here is this: would Brexit improve the living conditions of the poorest of Brits and the poorest of Europeans, or would it have a detrimental effect on the poorest Brits, those who are left or held, as I prefer to say, behind, in Europe and in continental Europe and the United Kingdom? It was my estimation that Brexit, just like Grexit, because I never supported Brexit,
Right.
would have the worst impact on the poorest of people, the people that we should care more about. That's one reason. Secondly, look, I spent my life as a young person and also not so young person demonstrating in Sylvan Square from the age of 12 against my governments, because I believe that a patriot should love their country and oppose their government when their government is wrong. That does not mean that I wanted to see the dissolution of the Greek state. Similarly, I'm a committed Europeanist. My opposition to the Troika, my opposition to Brussels, to Frankfurt, to the institutions of the European Union, is based on the fact that I think that what they're doing is bad for Europe. I do not want to bring down the European Union. In the same way, I never wanted to bring down the Greek state. I wanted a European Union that was working in the interests of the people. So my message to my friends and comrades in Britain was, the European Union sucks big time. Excuse my French. But you should stay in it. And we should fight together to fix it.
I want to talk a little bit about the ordinary man on the street and maybe embracing of things on the left or the right. I remember you write about Jeroen Dijsselbloem, and after that first press conference with him, the handshake, and he felt offended and walked off, and there was the symbolism of all of that. And afterwards you spoke about how people were cheering you, thanking you, cab drivers were honking when they saw you and waving at you. And I'd read that line, and literally just a couple of hours later, after an interview with somebody on the very far right of your political spectrum, Ilias Kastidiaris, we were walking outside Parliament, and a cab driver came by and saw him. Bow, 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 bow. Thumbs up towards him, and he felt very proud. And it was something for me as an outsider, because I just read about this a few hours before in your book, this kind of endorsement by someone. How do you feel that no matter how unpalatable, no matter how neo-Nazi, no matter how proto-fascist or whatever they might be, the guy even told me, he has no regrets about reading from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in Parliament. Oh no, I was just reading from a book. How do you feel that their views still resonate with so many people in this country, and that's why they're in Parliament?
I will answer in the manner in which I spoke during my first press conference in Berlin with Wolfgang Schäuble next to me.
They were not happy. You mentioned Nazis in front of Germans. They'll never be happy about that.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
Because if you think of back to what I said, and that connects to your question, what I said was, almost verbatim, the following. When I will go back to Athens, I said, and I go to my parliament to report on these deliberations with Wolfgang Schäuble, with the central bank, and so on. Right in front of my ministerial seat, there will be the thugs of Golden Dawn, members of parliament, who are the third largest party in Greece. This Great Depression of our country has bred political monsters It has hatched the serpent's egg. I believe that only the people of Germany can understand us. Only the people of Germany understand how a massive defeat, humiliation by foreign powers, followed by a deep economic crisis and the lack of hope, can generate these monsters. The people of Germany must be very proud of the fact that they have gotten rid of Nazism in this country. Our people need your help, because even though we put up a remarkable resistance against the Nazis in the 1940s, now the Nazis have started breeding in our country. We need your help. Now, how on earth can you take that and convert it into the statement that I read the next day in the German press? Varoufakis accuses Germany and Schäuble of being a Nazi.
Maybe they saw
only through
yeah.
the kind of distortions that one associates with the press in totalitarian regimes.
So maybe they saw it as cocky outsider who owes us money coming here and saying, unless you cancel my debt, there are going to be Nazis in my country.
Oh, but there's already Nazis in my country, right? So look, let me put it this way. There are two possible explanations. One is complete and utter cynicism of needing to fell a minister who is saying no to more loans. You see, do you catch the paradox here? I was a minister who was saying, I don't want more loans from you because this will be pushing or pouring good money after bad into the black hole of the Greek debt. I do not want your taxpayers to be giving us money that they will lose and we will lose. What I want is a rational economic plan so that you stop this silly process which is costing you and is costing us. And the second point I was making was that we admire you, we want your help. Now, there is no way any sensible journalist could have mistaken this for something else. So there was a quite clearly orchestrated campaign to distort what I was saying and to present me as somebody who was asking for more money from Germany rather than exactly the opposite. So when you have this truth reversal, effectively you're making somebody called Joseph Goebbels very happy in his grave, because he was the one who wrote the handbook on propaganda of how to indulge in truth reversal, to reverse something that somebody has said completely, tell a huge lie, and keep repeating it until the audience believes it.
There's a left-wing government at the moment, a party that you were involved with. I guess you weren't a Syriza member before you became finance minister, but there was an alliance. Your values were similar. You're no longer with them, you have your own party, but they're in charge. The country is, would you admit, not in the kind of depression it was in just a few years ago.
It is far worse.
It's worse.
Absolutely.
So with that in mind, are the
you don't
Nazis...
have to look to believe what I'm saying.
No, I mean...
Just look at the statistics.
So are the Nazis going to become more prevalent?
The only good thing about these Nazis is that they are murderers. They actually kill people. If they were not murderers, if they were smart enough not to kill people, they would have had 25% of the vote. So thankfully, they are such thugs that their popularity is contained. But going back to the earlier point, look, remember 2000, probably don't, in 2014, the world media were celebrating Greece as the Greek success story. There was no success. There was just a cynical part by the establishment in Europe and the media that pays lip service to them to present Greece as a success story in order to celebrate the end of the crisis. In reality, what was going on the ground in Greece was a steady degeneration, a steady slide into, deeper into our Great Depression. This is exactly what we have now. Do you know that this year, 50%, half of the graduates of medical schools, people that, Greek families, the Greek state, invested money on for 8-9 years to become qualified as doctors, left the country, they migrated. Do you know that as we speak, the total number of hours worked and paid for is lower today than it was a year ago, which was lower than 2 years ago? There is no improvement. What has happened is that there's been effectively complete stagnation. So what we have is, instead of seeing people on Cinema Square demonstrating, they now accept that they will have to live with 300 euros a month, and those who don't accept it leave the country. The metaphor I use is, what we had in 2015 was a prison break, a riot in a prison. In an awful, inhuman prison, the prisoners rioted. And of course, when that happens, you know that, you're a journalist, the television vans all arrive, and it's a big thing. And then when, after the prison riot has been completely and totally squashed and quashed by the police or the army or whatever, then it's no longer news. It does not mean that the conditions in prison are better. They could be getting worse. But just because the prisoners are silent and suffering in silence does not mean that you have improvement.
So is DiEM25 going to be instigating another prison riot?
Absolutely not. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be giving the people of Greece who know the situation an alternative. Because at the moment, the only reason why we're creating Mera25, which is DiEM25's party here in Greece, the only reason why we're doing that, the one thing that binds us together is we don't really want to be ministers and we don't want to be members of parliament, but we have a moral duty, a political duty, to say to the people of Greece, there is an alternative to this process of desertification. And here it is, and we're putting it on the table for you to consider. That is our objective.
$100 billion, that's what some people want you to be held accountable for. Because they believe you were negotiating.
Oh, it's gone up since the last time you checked.
How much is it now?
200.
$200 billion. Oh my God. So they want you accountable for that because they believe you were negotiating and negotiating and negotiating when there was an inevitability to this third bailout that eventually
Well, I
happened.
would like to believe that there was an inevitability. There wasn't. But anyway.
The word treason has even been mentioned. Does it hurt you?
No, it makes me extremely proud.
Why?
Extremely proud. Because these are the people who inflicted a huge cost on the Greek public and on the European public. They are the ones who caused effectively the loss of 2 generations in Greece. And they are paying me immense honor. It's actually, I wear it as a badge of honor that they want to unload their own crimes on me. It's touching. I thank them. But let's talk numbers, shall we?
Sure.
How should any finance minister around the world be judged? Allow me to suggest that a finance minister should be judged on the basis of 3 numbers. First is national income. What was national income before he became finance minister and what was it afterwards? Number 1. Number 2, how much money did he find in the state coffers when he arrived and how much money did he leave in the state coffers? And number 3, what was the debt when he took on the job and what was the debt when he left? If you look at those 3 numbers, there's no difference. National income had been falling from 2008, 2009, steadily. It fell in very large blocks. In 2011, we lost 9%, another 6% the next year. In 2014, the year before I arrived on the scene, we had lost 1.1% of GDP. Then in 2015, in the first part of 2015, when I was in the ministry, we lost 0.something%. Yeah. So effectively, the same process. I'm not saying that I reversed the crisis. No, I was not given the chance. But there was no substantial diminution in national income. The state's coffers had 150 million euros more when I passed on the baton to Euclid Tsakalotos, my successor, than when I entered. And the debt was slightly lower because I had made payments of the debt during my 5.5 months in office without taking any more debt on. Yep. The 100 billion that was mentioned, which then became 200 billion. Let me tell you what that money is. The Troika, since 2010, has been pushing those loans onto the Greek state to save the French and German banks, and then has been rolling them over. Second memorandum, and then in 2015, the third memorandum. The point I was making, and it was the point on which the Greek people decided to elect me in 2015. The point I was making was that at least 1/3 of our debt, which is 100 billion the total debt is 300 billion, one third was 100 billion. It's unpayable. And of course, everybody knows that. Just talk to any financier. It was absolutely unpayable. So what happens if you have an unpayable debt? There are only two options within the realm of possibility. One is that it will be cut. Yeah. So if you have a company that owes money to a bank, and for some reason, revenues have fallen, sales have fallen, the CEO goes to the banker and says, listen, I know I owe you X dollars, but I just can't repay it. If you force me to repay it, I will have to close down and then you get nothing. Bankers, every day, restructure those debts and accept haircuts so as to get something back rather than nothing back. General Motors, if you recall, in 2009, had a haircut of 90% of its debt. This is why General Motors is alive and kicking now, as we speak. So I was saying, that 100 billion will either have to be forgiven, written off, restructured, or the only other alternative is to borrow it, like getting another credit card to pay off a first credit card. Now, when you do that, you're actually committing a crime against logic, because your bankruptcy gets bigger, even though you are pretending to be repaying your debt. The 100 billion that they pinned on me was that unpayable debt, which I insisted should be haircut, and they insisted that it should be rolled over and put on the weakened shoulders of the Greek taxpayers. And they want to pin it on me, the only finance minister who refused to actually borrow it. That's why I'm saying they're doing me an immense honor by trying to unload their sins onto my shoulders.
You gave a personal finance analogy there, right? Or a company finance analogy. Mm-hmm. Going to the bank, I can't pay, I'm going to default, or and so forth, and trying to give it a haircut or restructure it. There was an exchange you had with some student, I think, or some young guy in London, where he spoke about, I have £10 in my pocket, and if I keep on buying £3 pints, I'm going to be living beyond my means. And that still seems to stick. From the European perspective, or the northwestern European perspective, is that why should we pay for the Greeks being lazy and corrupt and living above their means for so many years? Why are we footing the bill? Do you have any sympathy for that?
I have the same sympathy I have towards my daughter when she was 8 and she was making irrational statements. Yeah, of course I have sympathy, but they are wrong. And they are wrong to their own detriment, those who think this. And let me explain why. Well, firstly, I do believe that the Greek state was ridiculously irresponsible for decades. This is why I was out there demonstrating against Greek governments since I can remember. But you also have to remember that for every irresponsible borrower, there has to exist an irresponsible lender. So if I were to say to you, give me $1 million because I want to buy a house or to live the good life, and you gave it to me, you're just as much to blame for the mess that we will end up with as I am.
You're the former finance minister of Greece. I trust you.
Well, that's your prerogative and error. But anyway, so once, for whatever reason, a loan goes bad, it is a fact of capitalism that both sides must bear the burden. In the case of Greece in 2010, we had the amazing conception by European politicians like Schäuble and Christine Lagarde and Merkel and Sarkozy and so on, that bankers must never lose anything when they give silly loans. Yeah? Now, think about it. If this principle were to become common and commonly abided, capitalism would end. It would crash and burn. Because if bankers could be guaranteed to get every penny they gave back with interest, why would bankers scrutinize borrowers? They would give money to anyone. Huh? And if they gave money to anyone, capitalism would die. So the point I'm making is this. Moralizing is never a good guide to macroeconomics. And it's, in the end, it will only have victims both amongst the creditors and the debtors. So there is no doubt that the Greek people were going to suffer in 2010 as a result of the sins of governments for many years before. The question now is this: does a German, Slovak, Portuguese taxpayer deserve to suffer even more on behalf of the silly German and French bankers that were lending the Greeks, the Irish, the Spanish oligarchs as if there was no tomorrow? Because in the end, what is happening is that the German taxpayer is bailing out the German banker. Do they want to do this on the basis of a moralizing argument that turns one proud nation against the other?
But that's
If they do that,
the German politicians are telling the German people that you're not bailing us out. They're saying, no, you're bailing out those lazy Greeks.
yeah, but that's not true. And when you have politicians lying to their own people in the middle of the crisis, bad thing gets worse. And you end up with a situation where one proud nation loathes another. The Germans loathe the Greeks. The Greeks have plenty of historical reasons to loathe the Germans. And you end up with a Europe that's disintegrating. Now, how clever is that? To be doing this in order to keep under wraps and in the shadows the fact that in the end, the weak of the North and the weak of the South are bailing out the oligarchs of the North and the oligarchs of the South. Do we want a Europe in which the interests of the oligarchs prevail upon the interests of the European continent and European democracies, both in the North and in the South? I submit to you that we don't.
You are an accomplished man.
Thank you.
Professor, economist. I guess at the drop of a hat you could go to Austin, Texas, you could go to Australia, you could go to UK, Paris, whatever, take up a cushy position and do whatever you want to. You can be a consultant at millions of dollars, per month. Why all this trouble right now if you're fighting such a mega leviathan? You've seen the system from within. When you were within the system, trying to work within that system, you realized you can't do anything. They're too powerful. They're too massive.
That's not true. If my prime minister had backed my default, we would have changed Europe. I never felt helpless.
But you were closer then than you are now. Now you're like far
I never
away.
felt helpless in Brussels. I felt helpless in Athens.
You were
when
at
I
the table.
realized that my own comrades
Right.
were capitulating.
Okay, so I know you understand the logic. You were at the table. You were that close.
Yeah. But
And
remember,
yet
when
you
you are
popped out.
representing a bankrupt country,
Right.
you need two things in order for your presence at that table to make a difference. You need the support of your people that we had, and you want the support of your cabinet that I did not have.
So the way you're going about this now is in order to essentially become Prime Minister of Greece. To do what Tsipras didn't do.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a nightmare to be the Prime Minister of Greece. But then again, it's a dirty job. Somebody has to do it. I wish I didn't have to do it. I wish I could support Tsipras. I could support anyone who could do what is right by this country. At some point, you have to put your money where your mouth is, and if you are critical, you have to put forward the proposals that you believe would make a difference. And yes, be prepared to take it all the way to the echelons of power that can be utilized in order to implement those proposals.
When you see that even Bernie couldn't make a dent, Trump's in office in the US. Globally, does it dishearten you?
No, not
Why?
in the slightest. Look, our interpretation entails and is guided to a very large extent by what Antonio Gramsci referred to as, on the one hand, the pessimism of the faculties, and on the other hand, the optimism of the will. So, you will allow me to interpret what happened in the United States during the primaries last time as a magnificent example of how politics can be utilized for good. Because Bernie came out of no one, and nobody gave him any chance of even becoming known as a candidate for the presidency, and he almost won it. Now, you can say, let's despair because he didn't win it, or you can choose to say, let's celebrate the fact that he came so close, even though the whole establishment was so very much against him. I choose the latter.
If you were prime
You
minister,
know, because if I didn't choose the latter, I wouldn't be able to wake up in the morning and get things done.
Purpose. If you were prime minister today and you looked across the spectrum of world leaders, who would be your natural allies? I know Macron's a friend, but he's sort of centrist in his policies in many ways. Would he be a natural ally or a sellout?
Well, we can talk about Macron if you want, but more to the point. I think of Nixon in China. I'm mentioning this because in the end, those whom one does not consider to be potential allies, in the end, turn out to be possibly the optimal allies. Think of Reagan and Gorbachev. Until they met in Reykjavik, the whole world, journalists, you, me, everyone, imagined that they were the greatest adversaries. They met and they forged a very strong personal link, and in the end brought about, if you want, the end of the Cold War, and certainly a vast diminution in nuclear weaponry. So I would like to think that as long as you're steadfast and genuine and sincere, it is perfectly possible to come to terms with political opponents and to make the breakthrough which is necessary in order to alter this catastrophic path on which Europe finds itself.
What's the 25 in DiEM25?
That we think that Europe has until 2025 in order to pull its act together, and if it doesn't, it has no chance.
And how long are you giving yourself and your party to gain momentum to make a difference here?
25.
25?
I think it's important to have horizons and to give yourselves deadlines. You know from your own work, I know from my own work, without deadlines you are nowhere. So I believe that political parties must have expiry dates and movements must have expiry dates.
And leaders?
Absolutely.